Good evening, everyone. Want to welcome you to the program. We will give people an opportunity to log on. Our chat is open. We're always welcome your comments. If you want to let us know in the chat where you're zooming in from, anything you want to say to any of the panelists this evening, that's what the chat function is for. Welcome. We'll start shortly. Just want to say a quick good evening. We're giving everyone a chance to log on to this evening's program. We'd love to hear from you if you want to post a message in the chat. Thanks for joining us. We will start momentarily. Everybody's shy this evening. Nobody wants to put anything in the chat. Any of you want to be first? I think we will get started. I want to wish everyone a good evening. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I welcome you to tonight's program, Resisting Cultural Erasure in America. This is the first in a series of programs that we're calling Rising Up for Human Dignity. And all of these programs are in observance of Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month, which takes place in April. We're so pleased that Jennifer Fang and Barrett Holmes Pitner are with us this evening. We're also just delighted to be part of an amazing group of sponsors for this series, including, I'm going to name them all, Never Again Coalition, Oregon Historical Society, Portland State University's Holocaust and Genocide Studies Project, World Oregon, The Immigrant Story, Japanese American Museum of Oregon, Portland Chinatown Museum, 501 Museum, Native Arts and Culture Foundation, Kol Shalom Community for Humanistic Judaism, Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, U.S. Campaign for Burma, and we're also welcoming the support of Rabbi Eve Posen. So thank you so much to all of our sponsors for this evening. Throughout April, the series of events examines attempts at cultural erasure and the ways that communities have resisted and continue to resist these attempts. When we think about genocide, we typically think about the killing of a group of people. I imagine that you, like me, were just completely absorbed with the news from Ukraine and especially more recent. Tonight, we're going to look at the topic through a different lens, that being the destruction of a community's culture. And especially with a conversation such as this, we believe it's important that we take a moment to pay respect and honor the work of Indigenous nations, leaders, and families, and to their knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance in the face of attempted erasure. We acknowledge the systematic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that continue to affect Indigenous communities today. We know that resisting these policies and unacceptable behaviors requires occupiers of this land, including ourselves, to listen and amplify Indigenous voices while acknowledging our own complicity in the harm that these histories cause. Our goal is that this series will spark conversation and further learning that leads to informed action and plays a role in fostering a culture of respect, truth, and accountability in our community, one that encourages cultures to not just survive, but to truly thrive. We're just very, very excited and grateful that we have two speakers with us tonight who bring extensive expertise on this subject. And I'm just going to introduce both of them to you, and then we'll turn the program over. Jennifer Fang is the Director of Interpretation and Community Engagement at Pittock Mansion and is an adjunct professor of history at the University of Portland. She earned a PhD in US history from the University of Delaware with a specialization in race and immigration during the Cold War. She was a founding staff member of the Portland Chinatown Museum and served as the Director of Education at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. Along with Chelsea Rose, she guest co-edited the winter 2021 issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly about Oregon's early Chinese diaspora, which also included an article that she wrote, Erasure and Reclamation, centering diasporic Chinese populations in Oregon history. Barrett Holmes Pitner is the founder and philosopher-in-chief of the Sustainable Culture Lab. He's a contributing writer for the Daily Beast and the BBC, and a lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. His book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America, was released last year and named by NPR as one of the top books of the year. He holds a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. And I understand that Barrett and Jennifer were roommates at one time. So I think there's a story there, not sure if we'll get to it this evening. My colleague from World Oregon, Tim DeRoche, is going to facilitate your questions. I think we all know the drill by now. Post your questions in the Q&A tab. Once again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and I will turn the program to Jennifer and Barrett.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's an honor to be here to have this conversation with Barrett. I'd like to thank the Never Again Coalition, Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, World Oregon, Oregon Historical Society, and all of the many, many partners who have helped to support this event and the other events related to this one this month. So I think, Barrett, should we just get to it?
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Okay. So Barrett, your book, which is just so, it's such a great read. It's so interesting. It's just like, I mean, it's like mind opening and thought provoking. It's all the things. So your book makes this case that that Americans need to develop a language that can better describe the society they live in. So I thought that we could maybe start the conversation today by asking you to talk about just some of the problems that you identify in this book. And with these problems that you outlined, how does language offer a solution?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, the premise of the book in many ways is this word ethnocide. And ethnocide means the erasure of culture while keeping the people. And it's a word that hasn't been around for that long. It was actually coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin. And Lemkin is also the person who invented the word genocide. He was a Polish Jewish refugee. He fled the Nazis and came to America. When he was trying to tell the American government and military officials what was going on to his people, they just didn't believe that this could happen. You know, like Germany was the cultural center of Europe. They just didn't think that Germans could do such a thing. And there wasn't a word to describe it. And so no matter how many times he tried to articulate what was happening, it just wasn't clicking. So he realized he needed to create a new word. And that word was genocide. And then from there, you know, this whole new world opened up in people's minds of like the type of destruction that can happen. And, you know, there's whole organizations across the world that exist now to combat genocide, which prior to 1944 was not even a word that people imagined or in the what, you know, so words can drastically shape how people see the world and also how they see their society and see what human beings are capable of doing. And so ethnocide, I feel, has that same potential, but the thing that makes it different in like an American context to genocide to a certain extent is ethnocide is what occurred throughout the transatlantic slave trade. The goal of the slave trade was to get African people, destroy African culture, you know, not let African people, you know, their names were changed, religions were destroyed, languages were destroyed, everything that was African was intentionally destroyed to create, ideally, you know, in this negative sense of ideally, a people that could be oppressed in perpetuity for so that colonizers could obtain, you know, wealth or whatever. And so when you look at this in the context of the United States, this is a foundational idea for the formation of the nation, technically, like not technically after, but genocide of indigenous people was like first, and then the nation that was built upon that genocidal erasure would be one where ethnocide was at the core. And so if you're American and you live in the United States and there's a concept, a way of life that has been part of America since the beginning, and there's never been a word for it, that's really going to dramatically impede your capacity to understand and articulate the place in which you live. And so the book kind of starts with that, where if you don't have a word to describe a root concept of the place in which you live, there's a really good chance that you're going to need a new vocabulary and new ideas to adequately describe the things that you see and that you experience within the place that you live.
That's great. So, in this focus on language and like the shortcomings of American English to accurately describe and combat, American society's racist frameworks, you introduced a number of really useful terms. I mean, ethnocide obviously being one of them. Could you go over some of these like terms that kind of anchor every the chapters and the overall narrative?
Yeah, I can just rattle through a bunch of them, or is there one term that you thought was like the best?
Well, so I mean, ethnocide, obviously, but also I think, you ground a lot of what you say, a lot of what you're arguing in this, like, this existential, like, essence versus existence. You talk about good faith, bad faith. These are all things that I think, as I was reading, I was just like, okay, I get this. Like, it's like I read those works in college and it just kind of went way over my head. And then reading this book and seeing it applied in an American historical context, and then hearing the way that you, talk about your lived experiences in relation to these terms, it was like, oh, okay. So that's
perfect. Okay. I can rattle through a bunch of them. We'll go quick, or not too quick. But essentially the theory is, when I had ethnocide, and I recognize that there's a good chance we just don't have the words to describe what we need to say. And that's how I kind of came up with the word ethnocide. Like, Lemkin coined it in 1944, but I found out that he coined it in 1944 after I constructed it myself, and then did the research to find if that word was new or it already existed. Because for me as an American, I always viewed our problems more as a cultural problem and not a racial one. Like, I grew up in the South. I was around a bunch of white kids growing up. And so I knew that these people weren't like born racist. I knew there was a place in which they lived that encouraged them to become racist. And so that's clearly a cultural problem, not a racial problem. And so that's why I focus on culture. So once I recognize that the US may lack the words that we need, now it's, okay, let's see if other places have the words that we need. And I started looking at Europe, especially around World War I, World War II, because around that time, Europeans had, without intending to do so, were trying to wipe themselves off the planet. And when you're faced with ideas that could result in your own annihilation, a lot of people are going to start thinking up ideas to prevent themselves from killing themselves. And so that became like a repository for ideas, and that's where some of these came from. So the first one that Jennifer talked about is this existential idea from Jean-Paul Sartre, that existence precedes essence. And this concept just completely upended hundreds of years of European thought, because Europeans' philosophy for a long time had all been essence was the most important thing. And this emphasis on essence derives from Rene Descartes' I think, therefore I am. And that idea is I think, and my capacity to think proves that I exist. And that means that my essence, which are my thoughts, my ideas, my beliefs, are what make me human. And that's ridiculous, because, I was talking to these guys, and like, I have a son, he's 6 months. He can't think in any way that we would recognize like what thinking is. He just can't do it. He has no concept that he's a person or anything. He doesn't know anything. He's growing teeth right now. He doesn't even know what teeth are, And so, but he definitely exists. He exists before any of his thoughts, before anything. And so I'm perplexed at how Europeans had this notion that thinking is what made you a human being, when clearly there's human beings that matter a whole lot before they have even the capacity to think about themselves. So this idea is really important to the United States, because if you have a thought and this thought determines your humanity, that also entitles you to have thoughts that can erase somebody else's humanity. Because if I think that something, and that means I am that, that also means that if I think something about somebody else, they are that too. And this, whether the intent is this or not, it really allows you to justify dehumanizing and harming large swaths of people and feeling completely justified in doing so. And America's all about essence, as we would say in a philosophical way, like essence as in the idea of America, or the idea of one group of people being better than another one, or whatever. And so to get rid of this destructive concept, you have to attach into this existential perspective where existence precedes essence, where your humanity precedes your ideas. That doesn't mean that you can't have ideas. It just means that your humanity comes before it. So say, for example, I'm a really good basketball player, and my identity, everything that I define myself as, is attached to being really good at basketball. And then I wake up and I'm 40 and I can't play in the NBA anymore. If my essence is the most important thing, I will struggle to understand how I can live in the world. If my existence is more important than my essence, it'll be really easy for me to understand that this essence is gone. I can't play at an NBA level anymore, but I'm still a person who has potential and can do all sorts of stuff, and I won't be depressed, stuff like that. And so that's one example of essence. And you can see how ethnocide, if you're going to destroy a whole group of people, you could justify that destruction by saying they're not really people. And America does that a lot. Another concept, which is also a big existential one, is bad faith, or as Jean-Paul Sartre in French would say, mauvaise foi. And we are all accustomed to this idea of bad faith, in that if you talk to someone and they lie, they're engaging in bad faith. They're trying to deceive you. But in existentialism, Sartre changed it up, where what if I'm lying to myself, where I believe a lie to be true? So my actions aren't me intentionally lying to other people. It's me acting out a lie. I just believe that lie is the truth. So I think I'm acting in good faith, but it's because I'm delusional. Like what is that? What's the word for that? And so that's bad faith, where I would say like existential bad faith. And that's another big component of the United States, where we have all sorts of ideas based on like various essences or concepts of race or whatever that are just lies. They're not based on existence or reality, and we just believe them to be true. And so we then interact with people in this bad faith way, but we believe we have good intentions as we do it. That's really problematic. One of the biggest examples that Sartre gave in his book, Being in Nothingness, was that of a waiter, where he went to a restaurant and the waiter seemed a bit too precise in his actions, where like this person like believed he was a waiter, and not that he was a person who had made an agreement with the person that ran the restaurant to work as a waiter for X number of hours. This person thought his identity was that of a waiter, and that this preceded his existence. This was like really hard for a lot of Americans to grasp, because we're told that our profession is our identity so many times. And we believe that our identity, our profession defines ourselves, where we are told that being a waiter is good, and it's not. So there's all sorts of like, essentially a lot of the philosophies, whether it's French or German, that existed around this time, provides a language that we can use to articulate facets of American life that we see all the time, but we haven't had a phrase for it, so we don't think that much about it. But once you have a word to identify this thing you see all the time, you can then start discussing it and thinking about it and making improvements. And so, how was that?
That was great.
Perfect.
I think about, I mean, just, just this concept of using the term ethnocide to describe this this cultural erasure. And it just, I mean, you talk about it largely within the context of like African-American history and, your experiences as a Black man. I can see parallels to it in in Asian American studies and Asian American history. And, one of the things that Asian American scholars of Asian America have been talking about this issue of erasure for a long time, as have the scholars of, I think, all marginalized groups, simply because their histories are not represented, right? But one of the things that really one of the parallels that I really see is with Asian with Asians and Asian Americans. I think one of the things that roots their existence in the United States is this this relationship with white Americans, or white society, American society, that white people need the labor. They need Asian labor. They love or they have an appreciation for Asian culture, or they fetishize Asian culture, they appropriate it, but they don't want the people. And that I feel the adoption of that term ethnocide is so relevant in this context.
Yeah. So I'll say when my work I first started getting it out there, some of the people that gravitated towards it first right off the bat were Asian Americans, and it's funny, as an African American, everyone thinks that my work is just geared towards my own community or something like that. And it's I'm talking about culture and the destruction of culture. Everyone is going to be able to see this and see how it impacts their culture. And so for Asian Americans, and I have a whole chapter in there, and we actually trimmed it down a little bit in the book because my first draft of this came out at 500 pages. I was a real philosopher with the dense stuff here. But it's, with Asian Americans, there's that question that is always asked, where are you from? And the thing is, and this is it's weird to say, but the narrative of America, if you come here, is that you get white stuff. America doesn't say it that way, but if they told you that you came to America and you would get Black stuff, nobody would come to America. That's not a good advertising campaign to say you come here, you get treated like Black people. It's not. So you come here, you try to do all the stuff, and you want to get white stuff, even though they don't say it's white stuff, and then you don't get it because you can't be a white person. And it's one of these weird things where when Asian Americans are asked, where are you from? It's a question that feels as though it's trying to deny them of their Americanness because they don't look like a white person. And there's a clear tension there where I'm here, I'm trying to preserve my culture. There's a weird kind of Faustian bargain where I lose a little bit of it as I pursue money and stability. And there's a tension that's going to exist throughout that. And then for someone to look at you after your parents have worked for so long to make sure you get a good education, you are very proud to be, American and where you come from in Asia. And the person look at you and they don't even see any amount of America. They just see Asia. That is just a punch in the stomach. And that's articulated as an essentialist perspective, where the society is focused on the essence or the idea of the people and not the existence of it, where these Asian people exist in America. They are American. Clearly, they have a connection to someplace that's not Europe. They look Asian. It's a continent that has billions of people in it. There's a lot of people that'll have this physical appearance just statistically, and we should be able to have a conversation where you care about their existence, where their existence is as a person with Asian culture and American culture. And you should be able to ask questions where you're not trying to like have a tension between cultures while people are trying to like make a new one to a certain extent, which for me, it's really funny because I'm very curious about where people are from. And so whenever I see an Asian person, I always want to know like what country they like ancestrally come from, because those countries have been doing stuff that's interesting for thousands of years. Like they've been doing stuff that's cool before America was even an idea. And I want to talk to people about that. I have to change up how I say stuff so that they don't think I'm trying to erase the American identity. I'm like, I just want to focus on the Asian one because that one's real cool. Like I can't even ask, I have to ask, I have to frame it in other ways so it's not triggering, which is funny.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think with Asians, Asian Americans, there's also, I think there's a real like divide, especially now, I think in the aftermath or in the midst of this like racial reckoning that we're in, where, I think a lot of Asians want that to work their way up that racial hierarchy, and they want to like benefit from that, like being that proximity to whiteness, without, and there's such an ignorance of, I think, this history of how Asians have been used as as basically a wedge between Blacks and whites. And it's just, it just feels like more people need to know this, and more people need to.
And ethnocide like helps articulate that, because what ends up happening is when Asians come to America, and this is what most immigrant communities do, they try to find a place where there's people from their culture from that other country, and they work together and try to use their combined ingenuity resources to lift up the next generation, all sorts of stuff. It's like this whole collaborative thing makes perfect sense, like who wouldn't do that? But for Black Americans, ethnocide has created a status quo where like white society at large has normalized the fracturing of Black communities at every opportunity. So there's this narrative of like, well, one community is they're working hard and they can do it and they get it's like, yeah, but like they are creating the ones that are successful. And that's not like all of them, because like it's just the idea that we're having conversation about Asia as if it's some small place with not like a bunch of different cultures and like few people is ridiculous. But that's a longer conversation. But they are working together to lift up their community. And America says, this is great. And we'll use that to say that Black people are lazy, while America has just normalized just like the systemic like disruption and exploitation of Black people in every way. Like you can't go this, we're going to fund schools based on the parents' income. And is it our fault that the Black people don't have the good jobs and they live in the bad neighborhood? No. Oh, you need a loan? Here, we're going to give you a loan that's at a higher interest rate than the white people that live down the street from you. And just a coincidence, just happens to be a coincidence that all these things that make your life harder happen. And then when your whole community doesn't send a bunch of kids to Harvard, I guess it's because you didn't work hard enough. Look at the Asians. Like it's just a total joke. And when you have this thing that everyone sees and you don't have a word to articulate what's happening, then it's just feelings. But what's happening is ethnocide. It's just that the ethnocide is being applied differently to Asian people because they're different people with different stuff and a different history. And it's happening to Black people in a different way because the slave trade was a multi-century agenda of destroying African culture. And then chattel slavery was an agenda of having a mass of people in America who existed with their culture being destroyed and their communities being like fractured in perpetuity to like enrich white people and colonizers. Like, if you don't have a word for that, how can you even talk about what's happening in your own society?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So speaking of, of the transatlantic slave trade and Civil War Reconstruction. So your book does this really good job of historically contextualizing American ethnocide and offering like your lived experiences of it too. And in doing this, you present this narrative of American history that you have identified as the American cycle, which kind of counters the usual American narrative of progress. So I wondered if you could describe what this cycle is and how it offers a more accurate lens for understanding cultural erasure and white supremacy.
I love this question. I'll tell you, I've done a lot of talks on my book thus far since it came out in October. No one has asked me about the American cycle. And I find that like so bizarre because that chapter in and of itself is a textbook on its own. The fact that I had to condense it to a chapter was quite painful. But essentially, this is how I think America functions, is we have an ethnocidal culture at our foundation, one that's based on creating a language that normalizes division and exploitation and the creation of an other. And that other is created by one group of people, which in the book I call the ethnocider, exploiting the ethnocidee. And that's just how ethnocide works. And America just has so many words to say that this is a good thing. That's the corruption of our language. But at a certain point, some Americans are going to think that that's not a good idea. Makes sense. And the tension that forms the American cycle is America was a democracy. It is a democracy. That's what we say. So you have a democracy, which is based around all the people being equal. They have representation, and it's a collective we, not something that's based on normalized division. That's what democracy is about. So there's democracy and the tension that comes from ethnocide, where ethnocide clearly doesn't want an authentic democracy. And this is the tension. And so there's 4 stages in the American cycle, and we've gone through the cycle. We're basically gone through it 2 times. We're at the end of the second one, and this is where this is the vital part to see where we go as a society. So the first stage is the founding era, where they try to craft a democracy that also has ethnocide in it, where they can live harmoniously together. And so that'd be, the beginning of America, where you have the 3/5 compromise, you have the electoral college, you have all sorts, you have the North that doesn't have slavery, and you have the South that does have slavery. And they try to have a democracy that clearly isn't democratic. And what they also do is this democracy is not democratic will end up giving the oppressors a disproportionate influence in shaping the democracy. And so the South had a larger influence in shaping America than the North. And the best example for this is the distinction between Virginia and Pennsylvania. Around the founding, Pennsylvania and Virginia both had about the same amount of eligible white male voters. But Virginia dominated American politics. And I think out of the first 13 or 12 American presidents, 7 of them were from Virginia. The reason Virginia dominated is because of the 3/5 compromise, where they got representation for enslaving people in the South. So Virginia had more seats in the House of Representatives than Pennsylvania because they enslaved people. And that also meant they had more electoral college votes too. And so this not only undermines democracy, but encourages oppression. And that's what we had at the founding of the country. Eventually, people realized this is bad. And so then we would have the abolition era, where people want to abolish slavery. And so that's stage 2, you try to abolish it. After abolition wins, stage 3 is you try to reconstruct America in a way that's actually democratic. And America had the era of Reconstruction, where 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, basically all the parts of America that we think about today that define America came from Reconstruction. The parts that we think are quite destructive, a lot of those came before Reconstruction. And so what made America great is actually Reconstruction. But America back then, and still to this day, frankly, doesn't have the stomach for what equality would look like. And so Reconstruction only lasted 12 years. And then there was the era of redemption, where the Southerners, after Reconstruction ended, started trying to undo all the progress of Reconstruction. And this shows the corruption of American language, where it's called redemption, where they want to redeem the South. And by redeeming America, they meant make it oppressive and not democratic. So like redemption's a bad thing, but we call it a good thing because, you know, if you live in a place that's bad, doing bad things will be described as doing good things. And so the era of redemption happened and they undid everything. And next thing you know, the 20th century starts and it's Jim Crow. And this is where we get controversial, but we all know Jim Crow is bad. No one's denying that. But Jim Crow is the second founding era. This is where they had another attempt at having democracy and systemic racial oppression work hand in hand, where, you know, they had the South that was separate but equal. We knew that wasn't equal, but we did know it was separate. And we basically had apartheid from the early 20th century all the way to the 1960s, just normalized apartheid. That was the goal of the founding era. And we tried it again in the 20th century and we did it again. So next thing you know, we have to try to abolish Jim Crow. That's what the civil rights movement was. Lots of people try to talk about the civil rights movement as being the second Reconstruction, but no, I don't think it is. I think it's the second abolitionist movement because the goal of it was to abolish Jim Crow. And by abolishing Jim Crow, you would just reclaim the rights that we had won in Reconstruction. So it wasn't actually reconstructing, it was just getting back the parts that we earned in the previous Reconstruction. So this is a second abolitionist movement. And this is where the abolitionist movement gets really complicated, is that due to Jim Crow and the Redeemers movement and the progress of Reconstruction, you couldn't have overtly racist laws in America anymore. You had to have laws and policies that had no racist language, but had racist outcomes. That was the goal. Like separate but equal doesn't say racist. We know the outcome is segregation, but that doesn't say something bad in it linguistically. And so to abolish slavery, the first time, it's called slavery. That's one thing. We got to abolish that. What America did after you couldn't just use racist language is they would get every facet of existence that could influence someone who's not white and find language to undermine that person's existence without using racist language. That takes a long time to adequately undo because you can't say the language is racist. You have to like see the impact and get enough data, enough whatever to show the impact. So the abolitionist movement, it started in the 1960s, and I feel it went all the way to Obama. And then Obama was the second Reconstruction, where he tried to reconstruct America in a new, equitable way with a philosophy that stemmed from people of color and not from white Americans. And I think clearly, you know, Affordable Care Act, a lot of, first Latina Supreme Court justice. We had a lot of progress for the LGBTQ community. And this doesn't mean Obama was perfect. There's definitely things he could have done more, but Reconstruction also had a lot of opposition from people too, where Reconstruction could have done more too. And then Reconstruction ended and Donald Trump came, and that was the second redemption movement. And the thing that's really eerie about this is that the rhetoric that Trump used to win is the same rhetoric that they used in the 1860s and 1870s, where the redemption movement was to redeem the South, or like make the South great again. And Donald Trump's narrative was make America great again, not overtly racist language, but language that, if implemented, would have racist outcomes. And so Trump, didn't win re-election. He hasn't gone away. And now Joe Biden, who was basically Obama's deputy, he's trying to continue Reconstruction. And we just kind of have to see if America is at a place where we're capable of continuing Reconstruction, or are we going to succumb to what the cycle's always been and redeem the country by making it how it was when it was founded, perpetually divided and oppressive, but just use flowery language to describe bad things.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just thinking about it, thinking about, the past couple hundred years as like, as this cycle that has kind of, happened where, we're at the tail end of the second cycle. It is a really compelling way to understand not only the past but also like the present. And I think one of the things that whenever I teach Reconstruction to the like US history survey course that I teach, we always begin with Reconstruction. And the way that I always frame it is like, you have this moment, especially like during the like radical Reconstruction period, where it's like there's like more Black people elected to public office than there ever has been. The state constitutions that are coming out of the South are the most progressive, have never been as progressive.
Mhm.
And you have this one moment where it's like, wow, you could really have some like real meaningful change. And then it kind of just crumbles, and then you get, yeah, it's like you come out of it, they come out of it on the other side with Jim Crow.
Mhm.
And I can totally see this period now as like, yeah, this is,
But
a
it's the same
redemption.
thing, and we're not even as ambitious as they were in the 1800s, which is like, we have this narrative, the inevitability of progress. But if you just think of just how ambitious and bold people were in the 1860s, it's unimaginable that Americans would be that bold today. Like, just if you just the sheer numbers of enslaved people in the United States, it was, at the bare minimum, we're talking 20% of the population. And these southern states, a lot of these southern states, it was about 50-50. South Carolina, it was like 60% were enslaved. That's nuts to think about. Georgia, about 50, none of those people were even considered to be human beings prior to the Civil War. And in a decade, they became people and they could vote. Like, we're talking an enfranchisement of about 20% of the population as a whole, but the enfranchisement of like 50% of a state's population, like that. America has discussions every day about like undocumented workers, and if we could like accommodate just giving them citizenship. It's like, that's a nothing compared to what happened in Reconstruction. That should be easy. Like, there's so much space here. They're already here. They already have families. Yeah, of course. And then we should have the vision to be able to create policies in the future that, hopefully doesn't necessitate people to live here undocumented for like large chunks of their life. But that's just beyond our will at this point, which is a fraction of the will in the 1860s. So like, we have this narrative of we have a narrative of America progressing, and it's a nice one. Is it true? Like, if you, it's kind of like, it's really easy. It's hard to climb up a mountain. That takes a long time. Really fast to fall off one, So.
Well, and I think it begs the question is, yeah, it's like this narrative of progress, like, yeah, progress for who, and
But also like the same thing, like if you progress and you imagine that progress means you can't fall off the mountain, you're just delusional. No, like, sure, you can climb up, but that doesn't mean you can't slip and fall back down. You got to be wiser and more aware of history to know that like, it's hard. It's not inevitable. We're just like aren't innately magic people that just always get better. Like, no, that's just delusions. And if you look at American history, it becomes even apparent that like, not only are those delusions, just regardless of like how good you are as a people, it's just not accurate for our society. And it's easy to believe stuff that's not true when you don't have the language to articulate what is true. And that's where ethnocide kind of like opens the door for a new vocabulary.
Absolutely. Like, it's like a reality check for
Yep.
people. So do you think that ethnocide, like in an American context, is like a one size fits all process? Meaning, like, do you think it functions differently for different marginalized groups?
Oh yeah, 100%. Like, yeah, there, it's kind of, it's kind of like, say we're using sports as an analogy. Like basketball is basketball, but that doesn't mean that each team plays basketball the same way, you know, but we will know that that's basketball. So like that's ethnocide. How ethnocide is going to show up in the African American community is going to be different than how it shows up in the Asian American community. It'll still be the same thing. It just have like a different manifestation because the people are different. If you're going to destroy a people's culture, the approach of what you're going to destroy and why you want to destroy it will be different. And so, you know, like, and also clearly it's different for indigenous people too, because for indigenous, it's a combination of genocide and ethnocide, where, you know, if you look at the schools that they wanted to, you know, to Americanize indigenous children and make them no longer practice their culture because they could, you know, that's clearly ethnocide. That's different. For, you know, Black people, the destruction of African culture was just done from the moment they were forced onto boats across the Atlantic. And clearly that's going to result in a lot of people dying because, you know, they're going to terrorize people and kill a lot of people. But the end goal is going to be to keep the people without the culture. For like immigrant communities, it's kind of different. Like they're coming to the country under the pretenses that America's like different than what it is, that they can get white stuff without being white. And now there's a tension in like how much, it's like a give and take of how much of my culture am I willing to like sacrifice in order to get like economic stability. And like, can I, you know, like that's a thing where there's like economic pressures and not necessarily, you know, terrorism as the main aspect of it. But I think the terror that's been inflicted upon Asian Americans over the last year or so is a reminder that for, you know, that threat of the presence of non-European people with a culture is perceived as a threat to some people in this country. And that's clearly, you know, ethnocide, because they don't want all the Asian people to leave because they want the labor, you know, railroads don't make themselves, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
So
yeah, totally. And I mean, I think, you know, in regards to the attacks on Asian Americans, like in, you know, in the past year, it's like one of the things that's kind of disturbing or troubling to me is that like the responses, like Asian American, like community responses to this like uptick in racial violence really is like a call for more policing, right? It's like a call for like, for the police and, you know, elect the electeds to like care about Asian populations. And that just, I mean, it's obviously at odds with like other big racial stuff that's happening in this country right now. And, you know, just, it feels like there's still just a general disconnect between Asian Americans and like Black Americans, both of whom are like targets of racial violence.
Totally. And it's because we don't have the language to articulate what's happening. You know, if you live in a society that's normalizing division as a foundational principle, there's not going to be a desire for people of color to be able to work together. You know, that like the people who are getting exploited, they don't want them to work together because that will make it more likely that they'll find a way to not be exploited. And for immigrant communities, like I said, they come to the US under the premise that like it's a different place than it is. And they don't want to come here and believe that they're getting the treatment that Black people get. Like that's gonna be like a really harsh like gut punch where like you like literally move across an ocean to get what the people who run the country get, and you end up getting the treatment of the people who are being oppressed. Like that's going to be like rough. That'll make people cry, make them think they made like a big massive mistake in their whole life. Get that. And then the other thing that's going to be difficult is that the thoughts that will fix the problem also won't come from white America. Like this won't, like, that's not going to be, that's not, they're not going to spend as much time thinking about the nuances of oppression. Black people are going to think about that. And the problem of the discourse, and this is why I hope my book has like a big impact on people, is that the discourse is still, we use terms about race. It's a cultural problem. Like Asian people are only really considered a race like when they go someplace else, you know. Yeah. Like there's a continent filled with so many cultures, and they get here and we act like Cambodians and Koreans are like the same. Like it's a joke. Just the idea that Chinese is just like one monolithic thing. Like there's more people in China than all of Europe. And we act like they're the same. So it's a cultural problem. And once you can cultivate a language that's about culture, and your culture being harmed because of structures, then it makes it easier for there to be a discourse amongst Black people and Asian Americans and Latinos and Indigenous people where we can say it's happening differently in our communities, but we have a word for what it is. But if we're talking about race, well, that's a divisive word at its core, and our concepts for race in America derive from ethnocide. You know, like we say like the Black race, there's no place on the map called Black. Like Black is just an idea that like these Europeans wanted to give to the African people whose culture they destroyed, so they could say, if you have any of this color, not culture, because that got smashed, something bad's happened. These people, you know, so like even the discourse of race is a derivative of ethnocide. And so like by using the language of race, you're using a language that condones oppression. And as a person of color, it's a language that condones your own oppression, which that's not going to help you liberate yourself. And so.
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. And so you're touching on what I kind of wanted, what I want to ask in the next and last question before we shift to Q&A, which is, like language is part of the solution. So like, can you talk more about that? Like how do we as like a society resist and push back against ethnocide?
Yeah. So this is a fascinating question that I get all the time, because in America, we act like language is not important. And I think that's because of ethnocide, because if I'm going to oppress someone, they won't interact with me if they know I'm going to oppress them. So the words that come out of my mouth can't have a connection to my actual actions. You know, that would be, and I talk about this in the book, that's an example of bad faith. So we live in a place where like talk is cheap. You know, words don't have meaning. Things are easier said than done, where the expectation is that your words don't matter. What matters are your actions. But if you don't have words or philosophy that guides your actions, then like, what are your actions? And so there's a complete like fracturing of just like a foundational part of being a person, which is I say something out of my mouth that means something, and I will act based on that meaning, because the words that come out of my mouth need to matter. I need to be intentional about what I'm saying. We live in a place where people don't expect to be intentional or for their words to matter. Like if someone says, I'm going to go get coffee, they say, we should grab coffee. We don't expect that person to actually follow up and get coffee. It's just a nice thing to say, but it's empty and meaningless. And so that's the first problem, that like we just live in a place that we don't like to think about it, where we just expect our words to not matter at all. If you want to create a good place, you need to live in a place where your words do matter. And so, you know, that would be in and of itself countering ethnocide. And by knowing the word ethnocide and knowing that that word matters, you're already like engaging in the process. Because if you know that word exists, you know that it matters, then you're either going to consciously make decisions saying, I'm going to continue ethnocidal stuff, or I'm going to think ethnocide doesn't matter or doesn't exist, or I'm going to start acting in a way that I know isn't detrimental. And that's what happens. So now you start being more intentional about what you say. You start looking for words to describe the problems, and now that creates better actions. And so the key thing that people need to realize is that, like, if you believe your words matter, that naturally will impact your actions. And another thing that's also really bizarre is when you live in a society where people don't expect the words to matter, what they often are looking for is for like some divine person to just tell them what they need to do. And so if I just like thoughtlessly follow what a person says, then I'll do good stuff. That's not my goal here. The goal is to teach people. And if I can teach people how to like think and speak in a constructive and not destructive way, that should create constructive actions. That's just a really natural thing that's supposed to occur. And it's really fascinating how that, and I get this all the time, that's a very foreign idea for so many people in the US, that they don't think their words matter. They don't think that they have the capacity to do what they say. And what they want is for me to tell them what to do. And then they just like depend on me to tell them how to do stuff. I'm not here for that. And so that's what it's about. And so once you get to the end of the book, you know, I start putting out, and how the book is structured is by the end, you should have a new vocabulary. Like each chapter ramps up the words that I use in the previous one, that by the end, it's almost like you're speaking a new language. And that language also includes words you need to say to like be constructive. And so I think by the end of the book, it becomes evident how words can change things, because you will just start describing your own society differently and moving through it differently. And you'll see that, you know, pretty quickly, I think.
Totally. Thank you so much. I think just like the fundamental idea that that we live in a society that like values actions over words. It's like that.
Right. And there's no thought that's supposed to guide the actions.
Yes, exactly.
So it's just like thoughtless actions.
Mm-hmm.
That's chaos.
Yeah.
That is a nightmare. You know, it shouldn't be surprising that Americans love watching zombie movies and TV shows. You know, that's a whole horde of people that act all day long, full of actions. They can't speak and they can't think. And Americans are like, and then they casually describe themselves as, I'm a zombie at work. I'm a zombie. It's like, yeah. If you live in a place that says language and thoughts are nothing and actions are everything, you're definitely going to feel like a zombie. You're going to project that into the world. You know?
Totally. All right. Well, thank you, Barrett. I think that kind of wraps up the questions that I had for you. And now we can shift into the audience Q&A portion. And Eliza Canty-Jones from the Oregon Historical Society is actually going to moderate this portion for us.
Hi, everyone. Huge benefits of partner program. Tim DeRoche's Wi-Fi is not going great, so I'm really pleased to be able to be here. I've been listening in with my literal bowl of popcorn, so thank you all for a great conversation. You know, you're talking about language here, and I really appreciate that. And one of the, you know, it's something we spend a lot of time doing in our work, is thinking about very minute word choices, right? And I'm thinking about, there's been references to America throughout this conversation. What does America want to do? What will America do? You know, thinking about this American cycle, what is America going to do next? And I'm really interested to hear from both of you really in that context of how do you define America in that framework, right? So when we're thinking about what is America going to do in this time period, what has America done in the past, and really appreciate pushing back against this progress narrative. do you mean when you're talking about America in that framework? Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, you want me to go first? You want to go?
No, go ahead, Barrett.
Yeah, perfect. So like, I think the fact that that question is like significant highlights the profound problem that we're talking about, where like most societies, if you ask them what they are is an attachment to the land in which they've lived for the longest time. Like the name of the place in which they live is like they named the place and then the people said, I'm from here. And they say like, we have traditions and customs and way of life and theories of how to live that are based on being in this place and trying to like create stuff so that we can live here forever, you know? Not that it's here is the best place ever, but like, what else would you do? Why would you make something so that your time in this place could be short? It just doesn't make sense. That's how basically every place on the planet's tried to live since like the beginning of time. America has decided to do a completely different narrative where like this place, it's just an idea. And this idea has no attachment to the land and it has no collective desire to work together to sustain it. What it really has is a connection to an idea of a people from like a continent that's like really tiny and cold for the most part, being better than people in other places. And we can live here at the expense of all of these other people. And we know that this idea is really bad. So we don't really want to have a clarity about what America is. We want to exist as if it's just a question that we ask and don't care to answer. And so it's an example of like a people trying to live like as like in an acultural way, because there's no collective we in the society. There's no attachment to the place. There's no clear desire to like live in that place in perpetuity. And that clearly is going to create a lot of problems. And the way to solve that problem is to actually exist with culture, how people have lived forever. And America doesn't like doing that. And I think a key reason why they don't like doing it is colonizers, when they came over here, came up with this an idea of whiteness, where like if they have a drop of the existence of something that's not European, then their whole essence is gone. And if you live in a place that's not Europe, and you can only survive by not touching stuff that's not Europe, you're clearly not going to value the land in which you live. You're not going to value any of the people that are there. You're not really going to care about sustaining it. And so there's a narrative of like not being cultured. And so when we're talking about America, we're talking about, in many ways, just like a ahistorical, unsustainable, like status quo that likes to live in an idea of being perpetually great, and that idea trumping the existence of everyone that's there. And then let's see if we can solve these problems while being essentially like delusional all the time. And, you know, that's not really going to be helpful at anything. And so America's mostly an ethnocidal idea that I think as we become more empathetic as a society, and we try to interact with people as human beings and equitably, we realize that the idea isn't sustainable and we need to come up with a new one. And we struggle to get there because it requires us to ask some really profound, uncomfortable questions about the nature of a gigantic country that was created. So that's what I think of America.
I can
Offer Jennifer, yeah.
yeah, sure. I can try to follow up on that. So I guess maybe one way that I kind of want to try to answer this by also answering a question that popped up in the Q&A from Nancy Dawson that asks, it's to me, and it asks about the Oregon Historical Quarterly article in which I mention this Asian American scholar, Gary Okahiro, who makes this argument about the relationship between the margins and the mainstream, and how the people on the margins make the mainstream. I kind of think that like this idea of, I mean, I don't know, to improve or to really like, make this society a better one. I do think that change, is going to come from the outside, like that change. And by outside, I mean, I'm talking like, from people who have been generally excluded from the making of this nation. And I think that, a lot of this is founded on, or I guess it's based on the idea that like people on the margins, maybe this like belief that Barrett is talking about in like, people coming to this country because they believe in America, they want the white stuff, right? But maybe they also like, they come to this country because they like believe that this system is, is one way. And then they get here and they realize that it's actually not that way. And then there are, these like, there's this constant push coming from the margins to improve the system so that it works for everybody. And I think that that's like, that push that's coming from the margins is ultimately what is going to improve the ideals, like it will improve the ideals of this nation, and it will help to make sure that like that is working for everybody in this country.
So just to add on to that really quick, like that goes to the American cycle, where like democracy as an idea is a great idea. People should want to have a society that at a philosophical level exists to represent everyone and give everybody a voice and an opportunity to like have a big role of responsibility of making the society better. Anybody that lives in a country that is oppressive or, has gone through some sort of collapse or whatever, the narrative of democracy is you should want to get that. But America at a cultural level is ethnocidal. It's trying to destroy people's culture. And so, the solutions come from the people on the margins, the people of color, because they're here to sustain culture. They're trying to sustain their own culture. And by the fact that they live next to each other, there's a high likelihood that like Asians and Latinos and Black are going to mix, and they got to have a new, like, all right, how do I do like Black and Asian stuff? Like, what's this new culture look like where we preserve it? These are the thoughts that are going to happen from the people that exist to preserve culture. And that's sustainability. And that's where the ideas come from. That's why like Reconstruction had all these revolutionary ideas, because those ideas like this, how we sustain culture for everybody and not division and exploitation. Like the Reconstruction that I hope happens now will be a Reconstruction where all the people of color collaborate to sustain their culture while merging culture. And the white Americans who are also in this commitment to create a sustainable culture work with us, just like they did during Reconstruction. So like there's the tension. And so, but the revolutionary ideas come from the margins because they're less attached to the bad ideas. There's a less of a commitment to think the bad ideas are great. Like I have far less of a desire to think that Thomas Jefferson or our founding fathers were like the smartest people, but like white people have a way more commitment to think those guys are brilliant. And that makes sense. They're from their tribe, not my tribe,
Right. Yeah.
I'm so struck by this idea of thinking about the American cycle, and this is such a helpful framework. And so I'm thinking about two things. One is the ways in which the declaration, America is a nation of immigrants, is a form of ethnocide, right? Yeah. Because it's like, it's so, every time you hear that, and oftentimes very well-meaning people are trying to be inclusive with this statement, and it is a total negation of thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history and a whole genocide, on the continent.
I'm not an immigrant.
Right. Yeah. Right. There's that too. Right. So it's it discounts enslavement and theft of human beings from Africa, and it discounts genocide of Native people. Right. So So
Go ahead.
just
I'm agreeing with you.
yeah, right. The
100%.
ways that this language, but then I'm also thinking about this American cycle and the significance, or maybe lack thereof, of the changes in immigration policy in 1965, right? And this, Jennifer, is, where some of your own scholarship, draws in. So where do you see this sort of the 1965 Immigration Act? This is coming in the midst of the civil rights movement. You've talked about some of this place in the American cycle. Where does that fit into the American cycle? And just maybe more broadly thinking about immigration and ethnocide in the ways that, as you spoke about, earlier in the conversation, this can be used to, to actually divide, right? And now just add one more onto here, because I'm just going to turn my mic off and let you all go after this. I think the two of you, that there's a great question in the Q&A that's talking about adding to this, saying, we've got multicultural, and then we've also got united, right? As these sort of ways of thinking about what do these words mean in, or the potential for America or in our history. So I'll throw all that out there, answer whatever you feel like.
Can I go first real quick? Okay, I'll go quick, and then, but the immigration policies in the 1960s, that's abolition. Because if you look at all of the laws that America's first major immigration laws were immigration laws that prevented Asian people from coming to America and owning property and all that kind of stuff. Like they didn't need to create immigration laws pertaining to African people. Like the laws that they created for immigration for African people was the end of slavery on this date. Like that was it. There wasn't like boats of Africans coming here to work. And so like our regressive immigration laws came about during the era of redemption and Jim Crow, where they wanted to prevent people who weren't white or European from coming here. And so the narrative of America being a nation of immigrants, it's a narrative of like white immigrants, and trying to make that be the narrative of the society as a whole. Lyndon Johnson is a great example of abolition. Like abolitionists in the 1800s, a lot of white people, a lot of white people were abolitionists, and they were working with African Americans to end like this ethnocidal norm. Lyndon Johnson's clearly an example of that. And as more people from around the world were trying to come to America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, our immigration policies were also ethnocidal. And so that's that continuation. And you can see now that the America that we like now, that we rally around, the theory behind this America comes from people of color. I'm sure there's lots of white people who are abolitionists, but I'm pretty sure that the Black people wanted to abolish slavery first. And so, second place is pretty good, but it didn't come in first in that regard of wanting to abolish slavery or abolish Jim Crow. And so I think that's also like a tension that America has to reckon with, where like the ideals that we articulate as being American, that make us proud as American, a lot of these ideas just didn't come from like white Americans. They came from Black Americans, and the progress from these ideas happened because white Americans supported these Black ideas. And that's kind of how it shakes out. And, now they're Black ideas, while also Asian ideas and Latino ideas, because we're more diverse now because of the abolitionist movement of the 1960s.
Yeah, I think the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, like that, that cannot be understood in a vacuum. It has to be understood in relation to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So I think that those I think like overhauls really are part of, as Barrett said, like it is abolition. I also think that I don't know how this really like relates to like this earlier period of abolition, like in, within this American cycle, but like there's also the Cold War that needs to be factored in. And, a lot of the civil rights changes, like one of the reasons why I think the civil rights movement is able to achieve as much as they did is largely because America was pretty embarrassed about like its hypocrisy and its reputation. And it was very concerned about its reputation around the world. Like, how can the United States say that the American system is the best system? It's better than communism, when there is this like huge racial problem that the country hasn't grappled with. And so I think a lot of that, pushing through civil rights legislation, pushing through immigration reform, there's a lot of pressure there from people who are really worried about America's image around the world, which I think is, it's like you kind of just wish that like they would have made these changes because it's the right thing to do, as opposed to like, this is what's going to make America look good. But I think that is the case. And I guess, in thinking of that, like multicultural versus unified, it's kind of also like, it's like melting pot and salad bowl, like that type of, those analogies. I guess, I don't know, Barrett, I don't know where you stand on this, but in my mind, I'm like, nothing's going to get better until there's a seat for everybody, or until there's space for like everybody here to like be here and to exist as they want to exist.
I think the melting pot and salad bowl and whatever mosaic analogy is just like, propaganda wouldn't be like the right word, but like, you don't have a melting pot when you don't have a word for what the outcome of the melting is. Like, we don't have the word for the outcome, so we're not melting. It's just something that we like to say. And a salad bowl is like, that means we get to live harmoniously while not like really mixing. That clearly is not a thing that is going to happen, because if you recognize people as human beings, there's a high likelihood, if you live in a place surrounded by people of a bunch of different races, you're going to find someone that's really awesome, that's going to be a different vegetable or whatever it is. And now your child is not going to be like half of each vegetable, like you're not going to have like one child that's going to be like one vegetable and the other one's the other one. Like, they're going to be a mixture of the vegetables. And we don't have a word for what that is, because we don't have a language for a culture of people. We just have a language for divisive races of people. We like to have a narrative that these different races can live together harmoniously without mixing forever. And that we don't need to have a word for the inevitable mixing. And so it's just very problematic. It's like one really simple way to think about this. And this like still blows my mind that like, I don't think most people just don't think about this, but the South prior to the Civil War, and still largely to this day, like prior to the Civil War, we're talking like a lot of these states were 50-50. And they were 50-50 for 200 years, 150 years. And people think it makes sense that there's still a lot of white people in that area. Like, how does that make sense? If it's like half Black and half white, and they're being treated equally, and they're all human beings, they would just start mixing. And we would just have like a whole area with a massive population of mixed race people. Like, that's just what would happen. That's not saying that one group is better than the other. That's what happened. Since the Loving decision, interracial marriages have like gone through the roof in the US, and that's a really short period of time. And you're trying to say that like a whole swath of the country that at the bare minimum, we're talking like 30% is Black. And for hundreds of years, they've never developed a mixed race population that's like significant. Like, that's not natural. So that's a problem. And so the melting pot and salad bowl and mosaic is just a narrative that makes people feel good about like normalized division and oppression. If we want to have like progress, we need to start thinking of the words for what that mixed group of people is. And until we start developing that, like, we're just not going to go anywhere.
I think what you just said about that's not natural is really important, because I think, you know, what we've learned from scholars like the two of you and others who look at many of the topics that you've talked about tonight is that it takes a lot of work to institutionalize and maintain separation, to maintain the suppression. It's on behalf of a pretty small number of people. Like you know, it gives folks like me who carry whiteness certain privileges that are not insignificant and has for generations, but it's for a pretty small group of people who are continually coalescing power, right? And so I think we're closing the end of our time. So I want to, you know, throw out a question a little bit about language and future, because that's what we always ask historians to tell us about the future, right? But we've seen, you know, as somebody's noting in the questions today, a brilliant person is noting, thanks Kim for being here, that, you know, we saw a momentous occasion today. A Black woman was confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States. We saw earlier this week a Black man, Chris Smalls, organize a brand new union and win against an incredibly powerful company, Amazon, right? So we're seeing the kind of leadership that some of you all are talking about. What is the language that we can have? What can we draw on to really prevent, as Kimberly Moreland says, this second Reconstruction from crumbling? Because I think we can all see the very powerful attacks that are on it right now. There's attacks on the 14th Amendment. There's explicit attacks on the Loving decision and what undergirds it, right? So this is happening, right? What is the language that we can be using to prevent these attacks from succeeding?
You want me to go first?
Nope. I want you to go first.
Oh, yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So I guess the thing that's fascinating is like the examples you just gave of progress are of Black people doing things that like white people didn't think were possible. And like, that's just like what as a community, we're obligated to do all the time. That's like what we're doing in our community towards Reconstruction. That's just the status quo. Like if Black people exist in the society to live in the way that white people think we can live, we do nothing, like absolutely nothing. It'd just be sad. And so that the progress that Black people are doing, we should be able to see that as like the expectation of what people should do, and not, it is remarkable. You can't talk down to it, but that is indicative of how much other people need to start thinking beyond what America says is possible. Like that's how you reconstruct it. I think a lot of white Americans have a really like emotional attachment to the idea that like America is good and it'll just fix its problems. And if I let the American machine do what it says it'll do, it'll work out. And then the examples that they give of it working out are Black people being remarkable and doing things that the machine said they could never do. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so, when I look at the Ketanji Brown Jackson thing today, the thing that always annoys me is that she'll do something remarkable. And it's not just Ketanji, but this happens to pretty much any African-American that's doing something that's being considered unprecedented. There will be a whole slew of just rude, repugnant, obstruction, disrespect, and America doesn't seem to have a language for saying that those people are bad. Like we have a language for saying that, like, I don't like them and they're morally bad. We should think that these people when they're dead are going to live in a place that's like not cool. Let's worry about that later. Like we're all alive. We need to be able to articulate why they're bad in a context that matters for existence. And we don't seem capable of doing any of that. And so if you can't have a language that can precisely articulate why people are bad and what they're doing and why it harms everybody and why we need to imagine new laws to reconstruct things that like transcends the normalization and the tolerance of their systemic badness, then we're not going to fix anything. Like the amount of times I hear people talk about Obama and they're like, man, he should have done more of this and more of that and blah, blah, blah. And they never have a conversation about the obstructionism that he got was unprecedented. That we know the Republicans came up with ways to prevent legislation from going through that had never happened before. And we're expecting this Black guy who has surpassed all of our expectations to anticipate the opposition doing things they've never done before, and then to imagine how to get past that. And then we'll have conversations about how he needs to be better. And we don't have the language to say how bad these other people are. Like, if you can't articulate bad, then how are you going to win? Like, well, you're not going to do anything. And so I'm more concerned about white America and the rest of America cultivating a language to accurately describing why people are bad and why it's harmful. I'm not that worried about Black people doing stuff that transcends the imagination of white people. Like, we do that all the time, and that's why America's a good place. Like, that's just facts. Just look at history. That's what happens. So yeah.
Well, I think, and part of this, like, I mean, yes, to everything that you've said, Barrett, and I think also really just to like put it out there much more explicitly is like, I think there just needs to be like white people, white men, like there just needs to be a yielding of power. Like there needs to be like a redistribution of power and decision making as a whole. And to, I mean, not only to normalize, like, this society needs to, you know, do a lot of like introspection and a lot of tearing down and rebuilding. And, you know, we need to normalize this language for, you know, for explaining why things are bad, but we also just need to like normalize that this country is like that it is just like a diverse one, right? But like, I'm not saying that we need to like normalize, I don't know. It's not that we need to like normalize like these like initiatives to diversify. It's like, we just need to normalize the fact that there are like lots of different people living in this country.
Like, I just to real quick, just to add on that, like, the diversity of America has always been the reality. Like, the fact that we think that it wasn't, like, if there's a whole continent full of indigenous people, there are different tribes that have a diversity that's, you know, the same as the diversity of Asia or Europe or whatever, and then a whole bunch of people from a continent that are from the different countries in that continent all come here, clearly it's going to be diverse. And then they force African people on boats and bring them here, like, it's going to be diverse. The idea that we have a narrative that like it's not foundationally diverse is just propaganda. But one thing I'll add to talk about like the distribution of power and a Reconstruction idea, and this is a part in the book. There's this German idea, this philosopher Hegel came up with this. It's the master-slave dialectic. This is a dialectic which is like the conversation that the master and like the serf or the slave has. And the master's conversation is he has all the power and none of the responsibility. So like, if he works his slaves really hard and there's a great crop yield, he's like, I'm a genius, I'm the best. And if the crop yield isn't that good, those slaves are lazy. You know, the slave has a relationship where he has all of the responsibility and none of the power. You know, like if he works really hard and there's a great crop yield, he doesn't get any power from that, but he's responsible for all of this stuff. America at a foundational level, you just think about it, it's like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and people that like agreed with slavery, or at least agreed to like let it exist. They have a concept of freedom that comes from the perspective of being the master, where they want to accumulate power so that they can be irresponsible. They don't want to get power so that they can be responsible for other people. So you look at all these representatives where like they don't seem to look out for their constituents at all. People of color, when they become elected officials, they look out for their constituents all day long. And whenever they make some mistake that could make them seem irresponsible, everything comes down on them. Like, oh, you didn't do this. Everyone attacks them. But there's not an expectation that the people that are obtaining power to be irresponsible are ever expected to be responsible. This is a key thing. And because like having power isn't problematic. having power so that you can be irresponsible is very problematic. And I think that's a norm that America has. You can look at like CEOs where they get so much power, it insulates them from responsibility. They take a company and they go, oh, you did a horrible job. You destroyed the company. Here's $50 million so you don't have to work the rest of your life. Like, what? You know, you work at Fox News, you get caught like sexually assaulting ladies. They pay you like millions of dollars so that you just like have a parachute while you like live in shame for the rest of your life. Well, they don't actually shame you. They like, you go make a podcast or something, you know, like that's just a norm. And so that's the problem. Like, if we give people redistribute power, but the notion is you get power so you can be irresponsible, we're all going to be bad. That's it. And if freedom is viewed as obtaining power to be irresponsible, then we're just going to be a bad place. And that's just how it's been for the whole time. When Black people try to reconstruct society, they use their power to be responsible and do things that make people's lives better, such as, you know, we'll make it harder for people we'll advocate that you can't get guns and kill kids. Let's be responsible that like kids can go to school and not feel like they're going to get shot. That's something. A whole other group of people like, I'm not responsible for that. That was a bad guy with a gun. Someone else is responsible to make good people, and those good people get guns and then they won't do bad things with it. Like, that's the narrative. And so we just don't have a narrative for the normalization of all the bad stuff that we've had for ages. And that just makes it really easy for us to be bad. And that's how you reconstruct it.
I've really appreciated this combination of philosophy and history tonight. It's not one that I'm accustomed to, so thank you very much for this. I think we should wrap it up for the evening. I think probably a lot of us really appreciate being able to go on with this idea of thinking about the relationships between power and responsibility and irresponsibility, and can really, these questions that we always have about like, well, what do we do with this knowledge or new ways of thinking? I think really to be thinking about, we're always talking about this, where do you have power in your own life? Where are you giving other people power? And are you using it for responsibility? Are you using it responsibly? Are you asking other people to use it responsibly? Is maybe a good way to move on from this conversation. So there's some great things in the chat. Want to make sure folks know that this is the kickoff, and an amazing one it has been for a month long of programs. We'll be talking on April 14th about Rohingya stories of hope. On the 21st, we'll be talking about tools of survival related to tribal sovereignty in Oregon and beyond. The Yom HaShoah reading of the names on April 28th. And also many of the groups who've supported tonight's program. There's an event on April 14th looking at interrupting violence from the Holocaust to modern hate groups. So please follow all of the organizations. Links in the chat to Jennifer's wonderful introduction essay to the Chinese diaspora in Oregon, special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And Barrett, it looks like you have also a newsletter, a Substack newsletter, so you can look up Barrett Holmes Pitner and Pitner, get on that newsletter for these kinds of insights every day. Just want to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us this evening, and especially thank you very much, Jennifer and Barrett, for this really exciting conversation tonight. The recording will be available on the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education website, so please keep an eye out for that. And I think with that, we are over for the evening. So thank you all very much. Use your power responsibly and wisely, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.